afternoon. I think this is the first event that we've done after the sort of convention blitzes. I'm Steve Clemens. I direct the foreign policy programs here at the New America Foundation, and I normally have a really booming, robust voice, which you can hear has been somewhat damaged. I was there that Sarah Palin event, and also at Biden night, and you know, they were very, very exciting conventions, both the Republican and the Democratic sessions. But I'm in the sort of still exhausted post-convention phase. But we have a really great opportunity today to discuss a book and also the sort of political terrain as he sees it now in Washington, particularly after the conventions, with someone I'm a great fan of, former Senator Lincoln Chafee of Rhode Island, who's now at the Watson Institute for International Studies at Brown University. Let me say a few words about Link Chafee. I want to not just go through the stuff he's done, and mayor of Warwick, Rhode Island, you know, speaking of mayors. I got to know Lincoln Chafee first through his father. I worked in the Senate in the 90s for Senator Jeff Bingaman. And occasionally when you were taking that little car from the Hart or Dirksen Senate office buildings over to the Capitol, you get to sit with some pretty cool people. And one day it was just myself and Senator Chafee's dad, John Chafee. And, you know, John Chafee was, you know, kind of a, I mean, a very distinguished sort of Rhode Island-looking guy, if you were to imagine a Rhode Island-looking guy who was part of that, you know, crust of folks who knew what was going on. And he, I didn't know what to say, so I just said, "Hello, Senator." And he says, "You know Rhode Island?" And I said, "Well, I just happened to be up there recently doing something. I think what's it called? The university that has a lot of houses up there in Salve Regina." And he says, "Sounds like a Pell thing." And if you knew Claiborne Pell, who was also the long-term chairman of the Committee on Foreign Relations at the time, there was this kind of cool, grudging friendship and rivalry between Pell and Chafee that I got to sort of sense in my few moments on that train. And every once in a while I would see him again, but he had by that time labeled me a Pell guy when I was actually much more of a John Chafee guy. I kept telling him I used to head the Nixon Center in Washington. But of course John Chafee died and Lincoln Chafee came in, and Link joined the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, took on other committee responsibilities, and we sort of had some interesting tangles now and then via the internet. I had started a blog called The Washington Note, and The Washington Note, if there was any sort of guiding light to it beyond my own sort of silly thinking, it was how to get back on a track of principled American engagement in the world that paid both attention to progressive goals, but was realistic about getting there. Because I didn't see a lot of that kind of realistic assessment, nor had I seen sort of a sense of consequence of some of the choices the United States had made. And I had to face the fact in January of '05, after George Bush had beaten John Kerry in that presidential race, George Bush went to Brussels and he gave what I thought was an amazing speech that said everything I liked. That said we needed to restart our alliances, needed to push the reset button, needed to get back onto a different track. And I applauded George Bush on my blog. Got a lot of, I don't know, Helena probably said, boy, Helena Cobbin here is a regular reader and writer herself, you know, probably said to me, boy, you've really been taken in. And in March of '05, George Bush nominated John Bolton, someone I've known, and I respect John Bolton on many levels, but for the position of Ambassador to the United Nations. And I couldn't imagine a more sort of Jesse Helms-style pugnacious nationalist. And it was never about John Bolton, and never about how he treated his staff. It was all about what sort of face you were presenting the world and how you were going to do it. And it was a real violation, I thought, of President Bush's speech. And I thought at the time, and it was not personalizing this, but I thought at the time we needed to get back on track to sort of thinking through American strategy in the world, the terms of American engagement, and I became entranced and somewhat of a player behind the scenes on the John Bolton hearings that were held in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And Lincoln Chafee, in those hearings, mentioned Jack Pritchard in North Korea, looked at what Carl Ford had to say, dug into the testimony that Lawrence Wilkerson and many others had to give in the John Bolton side. And he didn't just make it about that, he made it about American strategy in the world, American foreign policy, and he basically did what very few other members on the Republican side of the committee did, he dug in deeply into that material. I know because I know all of the members of the Foreign Relations Committee and their staff members, and there were not many who were being served well by the Republican side. In fact, they wanted this to just kind of go and be done. And I remember a whole line of people, including Senator Biden, whom I really respect, but Joe Biden, Governor Bill Richardson, Senator Pat Leahy, Senator Richard Durbin, all went onto the Sunday morning talk shows and said, we're going to lose this on a party line vote. And I kept writing, we're not going to lose this because, you know, either Lamar Alexander or Lisa Murkowski or Link Chafee or Chuck Hagel or George Voinovich will, you know, say no. And certainly that narrative proved dominant. But it was a very rocky time, and it was the first foreign policy loss. It took 21 months, but the first foreign policy loss of the Bush administration. I kept running into Karl Rove, who kept telling me, Steve, we're going to check off that box. And I said, no, I don't think so. And Lincoln Chafee, there were about 3 big pushes on John Bolton, which Lincoln Chafee will remember well. And he didn't yield, particularly the second and third time when it would have been easy and convenient to do so. So I share that narrative because it's important to put it out on the record for everyone to know that when it came to a principled discussion of American strategy, he was one of the people who recognized this was not just an issue of consenting and agreeing to a presidential appointment in a minor way. It was a discussion of American strategy, American engagement in the world, and that brings me to his book, Against the Tide, How a Compliant Congress Empowered a Reckless President. And this is the book that I've been wanting to sort of have at New America Foundation and introduce to all of you, introduce you to Senator Chafee here in his new post-Senate role, commenting on this. Not in a partisan way in terms of commenting on this. He has worked with the chairman of my advisory council here, Rita Hauser, and also former Congressman Jim Leach in launching Republicans for Obama. He was careful in the conference call to say, I'm Republican for Obama in name only, because he's really an independent today and has joined that. And it's a great pleasure and honor for me to introduce you to Lincoln Chafee, and then I'll look forward to discussion after it. Please welcome Senator Lincoln Chafee.
Thank you, Steve, very much. It's a great pleasure to join everybody here this afternoon. And what I thought I'd do is talk about my years in the Senate and the elections that came every 2 years, and then talk about the '08 election coming up, and then entertain questions. Is that right? Mm-hmm. And of course, as Steve mentioned, I was appointed to the Senate in late 1999 when my dad died, and so I served for a year under President Clinton. And when I got there, of course, I followed national politics. I knew how partisan it was, the impeachment and the shutdown of the government and Newt Gingrich and all the fighting that was going on. But it still surprised me how partisan it really was when I got there. Felt like trench warfare with the Republicans on one side, Democrats on the other, no man's land in between.
Radical centrists in the middle.
Yes, we were caught in the barbed wire out there in no man's land, firing each other. And what I also saw is we were doing this strange dance in which the Republicans who controlled Congress would pass a bill that President Clinton would promise to veto. And he would exercise that promise, and we'd go on to the next issue. And it's happened over and over again: minimum wage, Patients' Bill of Rights, estate tax, the different issues that we were debating back then. And we kept doing that. Republicans would pass a bill, Clinton would veto it, we wouldn't have the votes to override, and on to the next issue. And so I said to our leader, Trent Lott, why don't we work with the president a little bit and compromise, whether it's estate tax or minimum wage, and get a bill that he'll sign. Doesn't that make sense? And have an accomplishment. And Trent said, no, we're getting ready for the 2000 elections. This is going to work in our favor, and we're going to build our numbers. I said, okay, well, that's your strategy. See how it plays out. Well, what happened in the 2000 elections, if you remember, it was a wipeout for the Republicans. Slade Gordon lost in Washington. The chairman of the Finance Committee, Bill Roth, Republican incumbent, lost in Delaware. Rod Graham's in Minnesota, Spencer Abraham in Michigan. These are Republican incumbents, and most famously, John Ashcroft lost in Missouri. Popular former Attorney General, former governor, and two-term senator, lost to the deceased Mel Carnahan in one of the quirks of election history. Mel Carnahan, if you remember, Governor Carnahan died in the plane crash, still on the ballot. And so John Ashcroft technically lost to a dead man. But the point is that the American people were making a statement. They're making a statement in the election of 2000. They're saying we're tired of this partisanship, and we're going to throw out all these Republican incumbents, Gorton, Roth, Abraham in Michigan, Rod Graham's in Minnesota. This is significant when incumbents lose from either party. And I was running in 2000, I won, and my opponent, my Democratic opponent, was trying to make the case that don't vote for Link Chafee. You may like him, the votes he's taken in his year in the Senate, and the positions he's taken, because we need a Democratic Senate. He was trying to make that case. And it just didn't have any traction because no one expected the Republicans to lose control of the Senate. My opponent, Bob Wagan, couldn't make that case because no one expected it to happen. But it did, just a proof of how much of a surprise it was. My opponent couldn't get that issue going. And also in the election of 2000, the candidates for president, Governor George W. Bush, was getting traction with the message, I'm a uniter, not a divider. That was resonating after all that partisanship of the 90s. I'm a uniter, not a divider. American people were saying, well, that's what we need in Washington. And he was also saying, and I remember it clearly because I was a supporter of the Bush-Cheney team in 2000, Jim Lehrer asked him in a debate with Al Gore, a good question to ask the candidates for President of the United States. What kind of foreign policy will you have if you're elected? Pretty fair question to ask the candidates for President of the United States. What kind of foreign policy we have? Remember it clear as day. I'm sure you do too. We'll have a humble foreign policy, said Governor George Bush, the candidate. If we're arrogant, the world will resent us. And I was cheering my TV saying, at this moment in history where America stands at the sole superpower status, if you will, yes, it's important to have a humble foreign policy. But what happened is they came in, and we all remember that long fight in Florida. Finally, the Supreme Court ruled in their favor, and the moderate Republicans would have a lunch every Wednesday. Snow Collins from Maine, Specter from Pennsylvania, Chafee from Rhode Island, Jefford, still a Republican from Vermont. And we had invited Richard Cheney to join us at our Wednesday lunch. And the Supreme Court ruled on a Tuesday in their favor in Florida. I thought, well, the Vice President's not going to join us. He's going to be too busy. But he did. He came in, and all the staff went out of the room. And this is December of 2000. It's just the six of us, the new Vice President-elect, 5 moderate Republicans. And we did a little small talk. And then the Vice President-elect laid out this agenda that literally had me, heard the cliche, I almost fell off my chair. Literally, at that lunch, I almost fell off my chair. He's saying, we're getting out of Kyoto. We don't care about the United Nations. We're International Criminal Court. We're going to have a $1.6 trillion tax cut. And I'm thinking, this isn't what you campaigned on. What won was I'm a uniter, not a divider. Whatever you might think about $1.6 trillion tax cut, it's going to be divisive. It's going to tear this Senate apart. We fought so hard for surpluses. Come in with this big tax cut. And how about that humble foreign policy? And I was, as that you talked about, you promised the American people in the debate. And 2 things happened at that lunch. The first was my Republican colleagues, the other 5, weren't pushing back. And in a 50-50 Senate, I thought, this lunch controls the agenda. This Wednesday lunch, us 5 Republicans potentially have the power to control the whole agenda. Every piece of legislation should be coming through this Wednesday lunch, because here's our 5 votes that can go with the Democrats, go with the Republicans in a 50-50 Senate. But what I saw, Vice President laying out this divisive, arrogant agenda at this lunch, and my Republican colleagues not pushing back, not saying, with all due respect, I don't think we can go along with this. It seemed as though they were going along with it. And it just staggered me. And the other thing that surprised me about that lunch was this is the Vice President, not the President, laying out this agenda that's so different from what they campaigned on. I'm thinking to myself, where do you come from? You're only the Vice President-elect, and yet you're saying everything we campaigned on, we're not going to govern. And I left that lunch thinking to myself, I'm going to be on my guard. I'm going to be on my guard. This is something different from what I expected as a supporter and contributor to Bush-Cheney in 2000. And sure enough, The president took the oath of office in January, and his first act, as you all know, first official act as senator, was an abortion, rescinding a Clinton-era abortion. And again, no matter how you may feel about abortion, there's no doubt it's one of the most divisive issues in the country. He waded right into it. First act, very symbolic. And that set the tone for the next months to come. Big, big fight over that $1.6 trillion tax cut in a 50-50 Senate. And against Bill Miller on one side, they lose Chafee, the votes are very even, beating up on Ben Nelson in Nebraska, beating up on John Breaux in Louisiana, trying to get them to support the tax cut. And eventually, as we all remember, Jim Jeffords leaves the party, and it was just turmoil. When I hear people say September 11th changed everything, it makes me furious, because I was there for the spring of '01 when the Bush-Cheney team came in with this arrogant, divisive agenda before September 11th. And then, of course, with the Jeffords defection, the committees all changed, the staffs changed. I mean, it was, if you remember, it was like tipping over the apple cart before September 11th. And then that beautiful, gorgeous day in September, only a few days from now, all of a sudden turned terrible as we all watched our TV, and in came the planes into the World Trade, and down they came into the Pentagon. And in this anger and fear that permeated all of our country, anger and fear, I said, this is a dangerous time. Or as I watch my TV, we can handle this wisely, or we can handle it poorly. There was anger and there was fear in our country. And so we had to respond in some way, and as a Senate, there was a resolution to give the president authorization to respond with force in Afghanistan. And I believe September 11th was a Tuesday. We met on a Thursday, I think, to vote on this authorization. And I walk into the Republicans had their meeting, the Democrats had theirs, to look at this draft of an authorization. I walk in, and it's an 8x10 sheet we're all handed, and it did say at the top, draft, 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 and then whereas, 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 therefore, we give the president authorization to respond. And in one of the whereases, it says, whereas this treacherous act, and treacherous was crossed off, and despicable was written in above it. I'm looking at my copy and thinking, well, technically it's not treacherous, because treachery comes from within, so they're probably right to cross off treacherous and write despicable. But don't they have enough time to go to the computer, delete treacherous, type in despicable, get rid of the drafts at the top, and give us 100 clean copies? And I'm thinking, this is just happening too fast. This is what we're handed. Draft, 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 words crossed off, and we're going to war. And I said to my colleagues, I think it was Gordon Smith, this is going too fast. We're going in to vote on this. And Gordon said, the train's left the station. And that was what it was like. Trains left the station. So we go in to vote. This is Afghanistan, a couple of days after September 11th. And they're calling the roll. There were two votes, one to give New York City emergency money, $20 billion or whatever it was, and then the war authorization. And the roll's being called, and I'm C, Chafee, so I come early. So I vote. I say no. And Senator next to me, we're all in the chamber for this vote. Link, you just voted against the money for New York City. I said, no, I'm voting against the war authorization. The other senator's saying, no, Link's right, this is the war authorization. No, it's the money for New York City. That's what it was like, yes.
You're kidding.
No, I'm not. I'm not. So I walked down to the well of the Senate to ask the parliamentarians, what are we voting on? And they were arguing. They were saying, it's the money for New York. No, it's the war authorization. And in their defense, everybody expected to be 100-0 on both votes. And so no one was paying attention what they were calling, but that's what it was like. And my staff set the 100-yard dash record from the office where they were watching on the screen, saw me vote no, and grabbed me by the lapels and said, you cannot vote against giving the president authorization to respond. And I trust my staff. They prevailed on me. The country's angry. You have to vote aye on this. And so before the roll was finished being called, I changed my vote to aye on the war authorization. And out of 535 members of Congress, 100 senators, 435 House members, only one voted no on Afghanistan. And that was Barbara Lee from Oakland. and she had death threats, had to have Capitol Police protection, hung in effigy around the country. And so I was going, phew. It was almost me. It wasn't long before I had my doubts, and it was all set by that Cheney lunch. You're going back on your promises. I supported you based on what you promised. We're going to regulate carbon dioxide. We're going to be uniters, not dividers. We're going to have a humble foreign policy. You're going back on those promises. And so I was on my guard. I wanted to vote no on Afghanistan, and I did on the first roll call. But then they started talking about Iraq right away. I mean, we moved into Afghanistan. That seemed to go quickly. And it was Iraq. I can remember my colleagues, Republicans and Democrats alike, saying, what are they talking about Iraq? It has nothing to do with al-Qaeda. But bit by bit, they started to fall in line. And again, I was on my guard. Once burned, twice shy. And when the president, vice president, the administrations talk about Saddam Hussein being a threat and having weapons of mass destruction, I wanted to see proof. And I took a visit to the CIA all on my own, went out to Langley, got in my car and said, I've got to vote on this. Show me everything you got. And it was a room with about 20 analysts, not the very, George Tenet wasn't there, but they were senior people. And for about an hour, they showed me different wire intercepts and satellite pictures. And I'm looking at it. I'm not an espionage expert, but I couldn't see anything. But more than anything else, I could tell from the body language of the analysts that were showing me this that they weren't absolutely enthusiastic. They would have been saying, see, Senator Chafee, right there, it's obvious there's some kind of chemical weapon depot or biological weapons here, or there's a missile site here. No, there was none of that. They kind of showed it to me and let me look at it and moved on to the next. So that really convinced me. This is all big charade here we've got going, and I went back to my Republican colleagues and I said what I'd seen, and I'm looking out at blank faces from they made up their minds. And I'm just saying, oh my gosh, we just finished with Vietnam. We're getting into another one. The train had left the station on this also. And they called the roll again. There were 2 votes in October of 2002. And the first one was an amendment offered by remember Jeffords had left, the Republican Party, Democrats were in charge, the chairman of the Armed Services Committee. I think the Armed Services Committee would have some say here. Carl Levin from Michigan, the chairman of Armed Services Committee, offered a resolution, an amendment, just to slow down the march to war. The Levin amendment was, let's let the UN Security Council debate this. Let's get the inspectors, remember Hans Blix and the inspectors, let them do their work. Let's just slow this down. And he was smart enough to put in there, knowing the fear and anger of the American people, we'll meet as a Senate within 24 hours. That was in the Levin Amendment. We'll meet within 24 hours if anything new comes up. And the Levin Amendment went down by the same vote. 1 vote difference, 76-24, down with Levin. And then hours later, aye to war. That's what it was like. No one even wanted to slow it down. The same vote, 77-23, aye to war. And curiously, as I looked at the roll call, a lot of the senators that had ambition were voting aye. That surprised me, particularly Democrats. Those that, they all ended up running for president, all voting aye. And those that, Ted Kennedy's and some of the others that maybe the days come and go, Sarbanes, were saying no. And one of the bravest votes of all of the no's were, because it was October of 2002, with the November elections only a few weeks away, was Paul Wellstone. He was up in a close race in Minnesota, and he had the guts to vote no to the war resolution. So that proves that not everybody was buying it and taking the political pressure of saying, I can't go back to my constituents and run for re-election. No, Paul Wellstone could. He could make that case. And nonetheless, it passed, as we know, and then the 2002 elections came, and Republicans picked up the seats they needed for the majority. Out went Cleveland in Georgia, and Carnahan, the widow of the governor who had taken his seat. And I'm watching thinking, if the Republicans are taking back, the bigger the margin, the worse it is for me. I like a close Senate where my vote's important. And there was a race in South Dakota in which John Thune, who ended up winning later, he was running against, in 2002, against Tim Johnson. And they were calling that for the Republicans that night. I'm watching, going, boy, that margin's stretching here. But what happened in South Dakota, they didn't realize that the Native American tribes in the western part of the state hadn't come in yet. And they came in at 90% Democrat. And Johnson held that seat by a few hundred votes. So that's what it was like. And then Paul Wellstone had died in the plane crash. Mondale had taken his place. That 2-year stretch, the first 2 years of the Bush-Cheney administration, was absolutely tumultuous. From the big tax cut to Jeffords leaving, to September 11th, to the Afghanistan, then on to Iraq, Paul Wellstone dying. It was something. Republicans taking back the Senate. And then it was on to the next cycle, which is the president re-election. And right away in 03 and 04, you could see the strategy. Energize the base. Energize the base. And no, don't worry if we have to divide the country to do it. Energize the base. Win by 50.0001% if we have to. And so we're having more votes on drilling in the Arctic Refuge, more votes on more tax cuts. Energize the base. And what did happen is that the Democrats nominated John Kerry, and he seemed intent on doing the opposite. Howard Dean seemed to catch some fire there in the anti-war. The Iraq war wasn't going well. Abu Ghraib was popping up. The bridge in Fallujah, where they hung the soldiers, and all the Iraqis are dancing and cheering around these burned, charred American servicemen. And Americans looking at this, going, this war, there's no weapons of mass destruction. And Howard Dean seemed to catch on to that, but the Democratic Party shifted gears kind of late and went with Kerry. And he picked Edwards, who had voted for the war. And so it seemed as though the Democratic Party was doing the opposite, not energizing their base. And we all remember the Swift Boat Veterans ads. Watching them, they were effective. But worse, John Kerry went windsurfing during this is a brass knuckles fight. And you can't be windsurfing when it's when you're in a back alley fight. And then I famously remember in August of 04, where the press asked John Kerry, if you know now what you knew then, would you still vote for the war? This is August. There's no weapons of mass destruction. Saddam was no threat. Would he not even have a helicopter, for crying out loud? And Kerry says, yes, I still would have voted. This is in August. And you could feel the air go out of the Kerry campaign. Just whoosh. And nonetheless, it was close. It was close. It came down to Ohio. And again, I'm watching back home in Rhode Island. The election results come in. And about 3 in the morning, my family's going to bed. I'm watching alone. Whatever it was, 2 or 3 in the morning. Ohio comes in. The TV lights up with Bush Cheney, re-elected for 4 more years. And I'm thinking, that's not good for me. I'm up in 06, and this isn't good for me. They're not going to change. And Rhode Islanders are not going to be happy with what's happening with the direction of the country. And it's not, and Bob Wagan ran against me in 2000, we need to change the Senate. It's going to be different this time. I could foresee it in my basement. And I start to think about my options at 3 in the morning. Do I run as a Democrat? Do I run as an independent? If I run as an independent, they're going to ask me, who are you going to caucus with? That's the first question. If you're elected as independent, caucus with the Democrats. Well, why don't you run as a Democrat? Well, how would that work? Do I get into a primary? All these things are going through my head. At the same time, I'm thinking there are 2 big bills coming up in the next cycle, 05, 06, before my election. The highway bill, which comes up every 6 years, taking the hundreds of billions of dollars of federal gas tax, its highway trust fund, and distributing to the states, hundreds of billions of dollars getting distributed to the states. And this is coming up in my cycle. The Republicans have a big margin now. They increased it in 04, in particular winning the southern states in 04. There's Michael Lynn's book about the Southern takeover of the Republican Party. In 04, it was the final Southern takeover, yes. Out went, even Edwards lost his seat in North Carolina. Fritz Hollins in South Carolina went Republican. Bob Graham in Florida retiring. These are Democrat incumbents, all going Republican. Zell Miller was still a Democrat. That turned Republican. John Breaux retired in Louisiana. That went Republican. So big margin had happened that night also. And so we had the highway bill coming up. Republicans control the Senate, the White House, the House, and I'm thinking there will be retribution. Rhode Island won't get a penny of highway money. And there's also the base realignment and closure bill coming up. Comes up every 10 years. Strike fear in the heart of every member of Congress, BRAC. And definitely Rhode Island would lose our military money under BRAC if I bolted. And I'm thinking this. So the next morning my brother comes over and we're walking around the yard and I'm outlining what I just told you, what different options I have. And I said, what do you think? He says, you're screwed. Actually, I think it was a little more colorful, but but I came back to Washington. We had a lame duck. After the election, the phone rings in my house out in McLean, and it's Mitch McConnell on the line. Senator McConnell is calling, and he said, "Link, I know what you must be thinking." Yeah. Yeah, and I was staggered because I thought they'd be popping champagne. We don't need that pesky Chafee anymore. We have 55-45 margin. His vote's irrelevant. We're not going to help him in his campaign. Good riddance, you know, all that stuff. No. Mitch McConnell was on the line saying, we want you in the party. We like your voice in the caucus. We're going to help you on BRAC. We're going to help you on the highway bill as best we can. We're going to be behind you in '06. We want you to stay as a Republican. And those Republicans, they're focused. I didn't get a call from the Democrats. No Democrat was calling and saying, I know what you must be thinking. And if you want to come over, we'll protect you on the highway bill, or we'll protect you. We won't pass BRAC if there's any retribution. That phone call never came. Made me think of the old line from the cowboy from Oklahoma. He said, I'm not, who was the cowboy back in the 30s? Will Rogers. Will Rogers said, I'm not a member of any organized political party. I'm a Democrat. That's what I was thinking when no phone call came from the Democrats. So I made my decision. I had to make it early on. I had to raise the money. And I made my decision. I'm going to run as a Republican. I knew I'd have a primary, which did materialize from the right. Here I am hanging on my fingernails to my seat, and I get a primary from the right. The party tried to head it off the best they could, but he was determined. But what happened is he was successful at raising the millions. And that was the most devastating part of that primary. I felt comfortable taking him on and beating him. But when he raised the millions, it bankrupted me. I had to counter back with the ads. And Rhode Island has a late primary in September, and just sapping all my money going into the general. Just September 12th, I think, was the primary with only weeks. And my Democratic opponent, huge war chest. I mean, the Democrats were motivated to take over the Senate. They were raising money by the fistfuls. And we were sent out on the campaign trail. As often happens, the majority party tees up an agenda to send the candidates out for the cycle, for the fall campaigns. We were sent out with this agenda in June and July. First, a vote on a constitutional amendment, weeks of debate, 3 weeks of debate, and then a vote, a constitutional amendment to forbid states from enacting their own gay marriage laws. Imagine that. This is the party of states' rights. We know the states are enacting, Vermont, California, Massachusetts, whatever, enacting the same sex marriage laws. We're going to have a constitutional amendment to stop that. That vote failed. And then it was on to an abortion vote, something to do with crossing state lines or something, making a felony or some kind of abortion. 3 weeks of debate, and then a vote on abortion. That failed, and then it was on to something that was happening on every street corner of America, a great threat to America, and that's flag burning. I mean, huge issue. Lots of flags being burned all over the country. I hadn't seen a flag burned in 30 years. But no, again, we're going to amend our Constitution, take our First Amendment rights of free speech away, and make it a crime to desecrate the flag. Never mind that old pesky First Amendment. And that was close. The House had passed it. The President promised to sign it. Very, very close vote on the flag burning constitutional amendment. Needed 2/3, needed 67 votes. And all the veterans groups were coming in to see me. And this was July. My primary's in September, saying, we come out in primaries. We'll be out there to beat you unless you vote for this. And I argued what I just said. Well, no one's burning the flag. More people are flying the flag than we've ever seen before. And secondly, per the Constitution, if it passes here, it then goes to every legislature, state legislature. Why poison 50 state legislatures with this non-issue? And they've got important issues in Alabama and Minnesota and Iowa and South Dakota to debate. And it's going to pull each of these 50 legislatures apart, as it is, being called unpatriotic not to support this, and having veterans groups come in. So I said, no, I'm voting against it. And that was one of the proudest votes I cast in the Senate, walking down it, and it failed by one vote. One vote. And curiously, only two other Republicans voted no to the flag-burning constitutional amendment. And when we're talking about spreading freedom around the world, we're reining it in here at home. It was so hypocritical. And those two Republicans were Bob Bennett of Utah and Mitch McConnell of Kentucky. Yeah, very interesting. The lines of conservatism, probably the two most conservative members of the Republican Party, Bennett from Utah and McConnell from Kentucky, are voting no. Freedom of speech. So conservatism and liberalism, if you will, they crossed on that issue, on that vote. And so that was the issues they sent us out on: gays, flags, and abortion, out to campaign on. And what happened in the fall campaign? Just like 2000, American people said, we've had enough, we've had enough. Out went Chafee, out went DeWine, out went Burns, out went Allen, out went Talent. That's significant, just like 2000, when incumbents lose. That's significant. And I was the victim of it. My opponent, all he talked about, we need to take over the Senate. 6 seats, 6 seats. That was his whole campaign, as I'm sure they were doing in other states. And it happened. The Democrats got their majority, and I've been a little bit disappointed in how they've exercised that majority, having been a victim of the wave that swept them in. But I did have the freedom, after losing, to assess where my party's going, my Republican Party. And I certainly was furious about the last 6 years of what had happened to my party, the surplus, what happened to it, and how did we get into these multiple wars around the globe and alienate our friends and foes alike. And would the pendulum swing back? That's what I was wondering. I just didn't think so. So I went down to my board of canvassers, became an independent. One little story attached to that. It was a small town in Rhode Island where I'm registered to vote. And after moving, I'd moved to a smaller town from where I'd been mayor. And the woman behind the counter said, "You can't change. You can't leave the Republican Party. Sure you wanted. You wouldn't let me sign the paper. Your dad is a Republican. You can't do that." The old Rhode Island Republicans, they wanted to. It's not your fault. You can stay a Republican. But finally said no. I thought about it for 6 months, and I'm becoming an independent. So that allowed me, as the presidential campaign approached, to choose either the Democrat or Republican primary to vote in Rhode Island. And I was watching, like we all were, the candidates, many of whom I've served with in the Senate as Republicans and Democrats both. And the Obama campaign impressed me. I'll be honest, I was watching everybody, didn't really have any bias, but I had served with Senator Obama for 2 years. I was wondering, was he ready for this? And the direction he wanted to take the country, and the change that he was promising, but also importantly for me was the organization that he was running. That impressed me. The other campaigns had management shakeups, cost overruns, not Obama. That team seemed to like each other, trust each other. They were frugal. That really impressed me. And he's the CEO of this gigantic organization operating under enormous pressure. Debates and primaries and Super Tuesdays and public appearances. What a flawless machine as an organization, I thought. And I thought that translates into an administration. And so I'm going to support Obama. I'm going to go into the Democratic Party primary, and the first Democrat I ever voted for in anywhere. I've been a loyal Republican my whole life. In 2004, I couldn't vote for Bush Cheney, so I wrote in the father, but I kept my Republican streak intact.
You wrote in George H.
I did. I wrote in George H.
That's really cool.
I wanted to keep my Republican streak. But I said, no, it's time to, this country, this election is so important, and this country needs this change so badly that I'm going to vote for Obama. And I called them and told them, and they said, well, I'll do whatever I can in Rhode Island to help. And I went to a senior event. They said, sure, you go out around Rhode Island. and help. And I went to a senior event talking on behalf of Obama, and a woman said, "Can we really vote for someone named Barack Hussein Obama?" And I like honesty. Someone was just laying it right out there. And I said, well, don't judge a book by its cover. And maybe you voted for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. That was a strange name. That turned out all right, and I'm trying to make my case. But curiously, a couple of days later at the Watson Institute, where I now work for International Studies at Brown, we had a South American conference. And after the conference, we started talking about the '08 election. And all these South Americans got really animated, talking about our election. And a woman from Ecuador raised her hand and said, the best thing America could do is elect someone named Barack Hussein Obama. And I think that is exactly where we are in this campaign. The woman at the senior center voicing all our insecurities. Can we really vote for? And the world saying, tell us the last 8 years isn't the real America. And the best way you can do that is big change. Barack Hussein Obama, I think that's where we are. And I don't know how it's going to turn out, but I'll be working for Obama. Thank you.
Thank you, Link. Thank you, Link. I have so many questions. I want to get to the floor, but I also want to say, as you probably know, Chapter 13 is my favorite. Chapter 13 is called The Kitchen Test, and it deals a little bit with the John Bolton arena, which came also at a dicey time, right around the BRAC issue, if I recall correctly. In fact, I think we won the John Bolton battle because of, let me just not get into the deep weeds, but the BRAC issue, in which Joe Lieberman played such an important role along with Susan Collins and others, required, they joined a letter to try to get the government to come in and give much more information about private meetings and things that were going on behind the scenes. And this happened at the same time that we were trying to make the case that we wanted senators in the Senate to get access to the intercepts that John Bolton had done. So it was wonderful. So Joe Lieberman actually supported our cause against Bolton because of BRAC. So there were some, and as I understand it, if you remember, Rhode Island, on a percentage basis, did better than any other state on BRAC. Yes. So you secured that. Yes. But I would be interested in any thoughts you had on the Bolton battle, in which you played such a key role. But another question is, another thing, I was in his office one day. I had stopped being barred at that point. And he had a graphic or a thing of all of his horse farrier licenses. I didn't really know what a farrier was. I was born in Kansas. My mom and dad were from Oklahoma and Texas, but I never lived there. But he was you shoed horses for years and years and years. There were a lot of things there. And it's raised this interesting question of how someone, obviously with a very different sort of local past or whatever, became such a sharp realist in foreign affairs. And obviously the importance of that is to think about someone like Sarah Palin in terms of what kinds of environments did you have to lead you towards a sort of smart analysis of foreign policy priorities, and what do you think needs to happen in her case? And I'd like to open up the floor.
Great, Steve. Yes, after college, I graduated in the 70s, and back then it was more popular to do
horses?
You could do things a little different,
Yeah.
Peace Corps or whatever.
Long blonde hair. You were a hippie.
Yeah, so I had grown up with horses. I always admired the horseshoer that came over. I found a school, went to the school, and then worked for a blacksmith on the harness track, the trotters and pacers. And then was very fortunate, went on my own, and I had good business, and did it for 7 years on different racetracks. And the best thing about it is it did give me confidence. When I was on the racetrack, no one was saying, oh, your dad's this, or were you from that, or what's your family? It was, you're going to do a good job shoeing my horse. The shoe's going to stay on, and he's going to pace and trot fluidly, and that's all that mattered. And so I got a lot of confidence I could survive in that rough and tumble atmosphere of the racetrack. And so when it came time to votes like Bolton, the first time around, we had the first vote, and I had said one thing to my Republicans back home. I was voting against the Bush-Cheney agenda time and time again, but I had to go back to my Republicans and say at least one thing that kept me a Republican, and that was I'm supporting his nominations. And having been a mayor, I did feel that once you win the election, you should have some freedom to build your team. And of course, the president just loves taking the most outrageous appointments possible, and the Boltons, the the most perfect example of that. Most unqualified diplomat to be our top diplomat. Most undiplomatic man to be our top diplomat. But that's what they revel in. And so it put me in a very no-win situation. I promised my Rhode Island Republican base, that's one thing I support. Let him build his team, as much as I didn't like it. So I was trapped there, and the roll was called in we had the vote the first time around on Bolton, and it was held, Chairman Lugar held it in the Capitol building, in the Foreign Relations room, and it was full. I mean, it was a little smaller room
I was
than
there. You
this.
looked very miserable,
Oh,
and
this-
I've never seen you look more miserable.
I want to be proud of every vote I cast, no matter how big or small, whatever thousands of votes we cast. I want to, for the rest of my life, be proud of that. And I was not proud of that vote. I was not proud of that vote. I knew I'd promised my Rhode Island Republicans that I would support the team. So the roll's being called, and prior to the roll, we had the arguments, and Dodd was fantastic. Chris Dodd in that room, he held up a chart of Bolton up here in his position of Undersecretary for Arms Control, whatever it was, in the State Department, and way up here in this organizational chart of the State Department. And there was some low-level person that he had gone and berated because he hadn't given an analysis that Bolton wanted. In other words, tell me what I want to hear. The poor analyst gave him some paper that was honest. Heaven forbid in this administration. And so Bolton, Dodd had this organizational chart of the big red arrow down through the organization to this fellow who he'd chewed out in front of his colleagues, embarrassed and humiliated. And Dodd in his booming voice carrying on about how this is not diplomatic. We can't have this man as our top diplomat. I'm saying, oh, I've made my decision. They call the roll. As they go through the roll, all of a sudden, George Voinovich says, Mr. Chairman, from what I've heard here today, I haven't really followed this. I've had other committees, so I haven't really, hard to believe. Bolton was on the front page of every day, it seemed, to the paper.
He knew what he was doing.
He said, I can't vote for this man. Came out of nowhere. No one had ever thought that Voinovich. And he said, my mom used to say, if you can't sit at the kitchen table and have a good conversation with him, then that's the test. And I don't think I could sit at the kitchen table with John Bolton. And all of a sudden, the vote was gone, and it was over. That was the vote that the Democrats, they all held. Voinovich, no. And so Chairman Lugar stopped the roll, and they quickly made some alternative arrangements. But ultimately, the president made a recess appointment, if you remember. So Bolton served for his 1 year that you're allowed under the Constitution, or through the finish of that Congress. And then they wanted to keep him on, and that's when I'd had enough.
Well, they pushed him through, again, tried to push him through at the time of the Israel-Lebanon war.
Yes.
And using the Lebanon war, and then the campaign that a vote against Bolton was a vote against Israel.
Yes.
And I think at that point you just said, okay, I've had enough.
Yes, the summer of '06, he came back as they tried to come, but that's when I said I've had enough, and I'm a no vote.
That's interesting. Let me open the floor. Jed Schilling.
Yeah, just a question.
Oh, if you could take the microphone there, too.
Sorry.
Since we're online, hello, folks on the web.
Okay.
Yes.
You'd mentioned about how you and some of your other colleagues had voted on a number of issues, particularly going up to the Iraq War and things like that. Could you comment a little bit about how the maverick in the Senate, McCain, was willing to stand up, or was he just in line with the administration and going ahead on some of these key votes?
Well, you're right. And I talked about the Cheney lunch and my fellow moderate Republicans not pushing back at this key moment in history, when that was the time to push back, right there at that lunch. Don't let them get any momentum. And my other Republican colleagues, it has mystified me to this day, senators, Republicans that have been there for years, seen us work so hard for surpluses, worked on international issues, Republicans.
Who were the five?
The moderate Republicans were Specter, Collins, Snow, and Jeffords back then. But also other Republicans through the course of my time there that didn't go down to the White House and say, with all due respect, Mr. President, you're not going to get this. That's what I expected to happen. For those senators, Republicans, that have been there for years and years and worked to build the surpluses, worked to build international alliances, to watch them all ripped up in front of our eyes, it mystified me. Why not just go down? You don't have to make a public scene, embarrass the president, quietly go down with a group, enough of votes, and say, you're not going to get this. McCain was one to buck it. He was one of the few that would buck the administration. And he's an unpredictable man. In the tax cut debates of the spring of 2001, there were a group of us that were trying to scale back the tax cuts. Jeffords, myself, Nelson, Ben Nelson, John Breaux. McCain was never part of that effort. And we even had a key vote on the Harkin Amendment, which scaled back the tax cut. And McCain didn't vote with us, which was the Harkin Amendment. But when it came time to vote on the final tax cut,
You voted against it.
he voted against it. And he came out of nowhere. So very, very unpredictable. He was good on the environment in the Senate, good on a vote on ANWR time and time again, holding on those close votes on drilling the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, good with the Gang of 14 Supreme Court judges. So now we see him running for president, and it's a completely different John McCain.
What
So
about on the Iraq?
Unpredictable is the best word I could.
On Iraq, how did he stand on Iraq? Because I understand he was supporting the invasion even before the amendment.
On foreign issues, that's one area where he's been consistent. He's a belligerent, aggressive proponent of how we deal with the
Let's
world.
get to, Helena Cobham?
Hi, Senator. I'm really happy that you've written the book and looking forward to reading it. I remember hearing you talk at the Leadership Council of Churches for Middle East Peace, and I've admired you since before then, but I really admired the work you did for Middle East peace in various contexts. You said that always wanted to be proud of every vote that you cast, whether it's big or small, and you talked a little bit about that vote on September 13th of 2001. Obviously, all of us were living through that kind of traumatic period. Subsequently, the war in Afghanistan has gotten the kind of the sobriquet of, are we allowed to speak French? The little name of the good war. But it strikes me looking at it right now, 7 years later, it's by no means as clear that the country has succeeded in doing what needs to be done there. And do you ever have regrets about having changed your mind on that day? And I mean, just to explore that a little bit more and what you would like to see happen in Afghanistan.
Afghanistan vote, September 13th.
Yes, I did listen to my staff. They made the point. I saw what happened to Barbara Lee. And ultimately, the question was me, do I trust Bush Cheney? And I had this nagging feeling, you can't trust them. And ultimately, if he'd done it similar to the way his father did in the first Gulf War, bring the international community and going through the Security Council, I do think it would have been different. So I try not to have too many regrets, particularly about that vote. And I think the big challenge that we face is bringing the international community on our side. I mean, they can be enthusiastically on our side, or they can be unenthusiastically on our side. And I think the latter is the case now, if they're on our side at all.
Right here.
Hi, Kiki Ryan, the Washington Examiner. Thinking about this upcoming election, I just wanted to see what your thoughts on Sarah Palin were, specifically your similar mayoral backgrounds. And do you think that the Obama campaign needs to worry, or is she just sort of a splash in the pan?
Good question. I don't have a crystal ball, but there's no doubt that everywhere people are talking about her, at the water cooler and the coffee shops, and she seems to have taken a lackluster McCain candidacy and energized it, and that's the Karl Rove strategy. I mean, watching her give this speech, I'm saying that the Karl Rove, they're brilliant, these people, and they've just thrown this firestorm, this tornado, into the whole presidential election. The surprise that I didn't expect that seemed to occur the next day after her speech was that it possibly energized the wrong base, the left. People were coming into my office, phone calls were flooding in, emails were coming in. I just sent money to Obama. I couldn't sleep last night, from the left, to see this cocky wacko up there.
Did you just say cocky wacko? Just love those lines. Yes, sir, right here.
I'm old enough to remember when moderate Republicans were not extinct. I'm thinking of, Rockefeller and Javits and Scranton and so forth.
John Chafee.
John Chafee, certainly. And I guess my question is, you obviously declared as an independent because you're not terribly sanguine about the possibility of any kind of moderate wing of the Republican Party emerging within the immediate future. Is it a viable thought at all that moderate Republicans might become a very influential force as they were in the Javits and that whole era?
By the evidence of my effort to run in '06, both on fundraising, I couldn't raise a nickel. My pro-choice, pro-environment, anti-war Republicans were saying, sorry, helped you in 2000, but not this time. And they've gone. They're gone to other pastures. And we saw that in New Hampshire where the two congressmen lost, two Republican incumbents, and even New Hampshire lost. And in Connecticut, Nancy Johnson, Rob Simmons. In Iowa, Jim Leach, all losing just because they have the R. I mean, their constituents like them, and they have high approval ratings, and they work hard for their constituents, but they have that R. And so I don't see it coming back. I don't see it coming back.
Other questions? Yes, in the very back.
Christy Todd Whitman has an effort, Governor Whitman, called It's My Party Too, and she's calling to get me involved in it. And I think you're whistling in the dark, Christy. And look at the convention. I mean, who fires them up? The far right.
Yes.
Carolyn
Issues
Poplin?
that aren't our priorities as old Rockefeller Republicans. I consider myself conservative on finances, on international, on the environment. I consider that conservative. Personal liberties, the Fourth Amendment, and you need a warrant to wiretap. That's not my Republican Party.
Well, you know, Chuck Hagel has spoken here many, many times and makes the same exact point. He remains a Republican, but he feels as if he's, you know, clearly under target. And what's odd is that he is, you know, a real conservative in the sense of a classic conservative, and often votes with the Bush administration's foreign policy and national security issues, which he thinks they've left him, and it's been hard. And I've often, because I am an advocate, in fact, I would consider myself one of these progressive Republican types, and my progressive friends don't like to hear that. I used to head the Nixon Center. I can't support the Bush administration. I can't support John McCain with his current foreign policy views. But it's very interesting on whether you approach the question of trying to earnestly build a more moderate wing of the Republican Party, or whether it's better to let the Republican Party become so narrowly defined that eventually it shipwrecks, and then the wreckage is then hijackable, just as the Republican Party was hijacked by a group of people, and Christy Whitman makes this case, that I don't see any reason why it can't be hijacked back, but you need failure to soften up that thing, and they haven't failed yet, and that's a real problem. I mean, you know, I know a lot of people will hate me saying, well, they have failed, but they haven't failed in terms of power. They've got to fail in terms of the raw, crude side of power. Yes.
Like we Democrats did.
What's that?
Like we Democrats did.
Yeah, exactly. You Democrat. I'm an independent. So.
I'm a Democrat. What are we doing wrong?
What are the Democrats doing wrong?
It seems like we have the candidate, we have the issues, particularly the issues, the McCain, whether he's a maverick or not, his positions on taxes and other domestic issues and the economy and foreign policy are all the Bush, are all on the Bush side.
So
and yet the race is dead even.
So backseat driving, what is your candidate doing wrong?
It is a mystery that this could be close on the issues that I would think the Americans care about, environment and personal liberties, and particularly credibility. We've seen the premise that it's okay to be untruthful with the American people. I'm a united, not a divider. We're going to have a humble foreign policy. Saddam Hussein's a threat. We're going to regulate carbon dioxide. We don't torture. We don't warrantless wiretap, all of which were not honest answers to good questions the American people are asking. And now to see Senator McCain take issues such as the environment, Supreme Court, and taxes, and do the opposite. He's sacrificing all his credibility, to me. I mean, it's good questions to ask candidates. What kind of Supreme Court judge is he going to nominate? And I don't want people to be saying, oh, he said that because he needs to say it to the base. No. I want an honest answer. And when he says it's going to be more along the line of Bush-Cheney, Well, you lost all your credibility then. I think that's one of the biggest tasks in this election, is restoring American credibility around the world and at home. I have great faith in the American people, and I have faith in the Obama campaign. From what I've seen in the past performance is any indication, they're going to get energized. And the young people working at Brown University, a new phenomenon of young people caring about the debates and caring about the primaries and caring about this election. In the past, it seemed they were apathetic. Not this time. It's their future, and they're grabbing the bull by the horns. That's a key vote.
In my friendly editorial behind Senator Chafee, I would say that one of the challenges for Barack Obama, let me put it in the Republican context. One of the reasons I first knew about this vicious divide between the neoconservatives and the realists wasn't 9/11. It was because our senior fellow here, Robert Kaplan, was being called to tutor George Bush under Condi Rice's direction to help guide him on what a kind of neo-realism would look like. And it was very interesting. One of the things Bob Kaplan told me, he advised Bush because he was looking at the caucuses and other things, and he said to Bush, apparently, that you needed to talk about democracy, you needed to talk about these things, but your actions need to do so. You need to recognize power and stability in these questions, and it's very, very interesting that that was there. And I think that was actually very smart counsel at the time, which probably helped Bush deal with the April 2001 China incident. He got to it better. People forget that, but that was when Paul Wolfowitz really began to try and ascend and take over the helm, if you will, of the government's national security apparatus, and that didn't happen. But 9/11 put that beyond. In the Democratic sense, what I see, and I say this with Dave Meyer here, who's very tied into the whole network of young grungy bloggers and activists in the country, and I say that as a compliment. That there's a Barack Obama really connected with these crowd. They were very important in the challenge with Hillary Clinton. But since then, in the triangulation that Obama has done, they deny that they have, but there clearly has been triangulation. The very passionate legs of his first campaign are not that passionate now after the FISA vote, and I would give Obama the same kind of advice Bob Kaplan did, which is be very careful about the substance of your actions, like the FISA vote and other things. Talk about what you will, but the substantive side needs to right now be with the base, particularly the liberal base, which has been so disenchanted because it's been their diminishment of enthusiasm, which I think has been one of the most interesting things that has happened since Obama has emerged as a leader, if that's fair. So any other questions? 'Cause I want to give a chance for Senator Chafee to sign books. We've arranged for book sales here. I'm going to get mine. I hope you get yours. And we're going to bring him out here, by the way. But any other question? Beth, did you have your hand up? Beth Bowles?
I just wanted to thank you so much, Senator.
Why don't you wait for the microphone, Beth?
I'm sorry. Thank you.
Beth Bowles with the John Glenn Institute of the University of Ohio.
It's very nice to meet you, and I've been a longtime fan. I just wondered if you can talk a little bit about how we return, sort of following up on your question about why things look the way they are. Why is veracity and credibility, as you referred to a moment ago, not more salient in this culture?
Yes, that's the old bumper sticker, where's the outrage? And certainly on our truthfulness, it seems like it's okay, and it's not okay. And it spreads from the top, the President of the United States, it filters down into Wall Street and baseball. It's okay to be on steroids and on. It's okay not to play by the rules. And no, it's not okay. And that it comes from the top, I believe. And Obama does say we need to fiercely and consistently tell the truth. I like that line. Fiercely and consistently. It's only with consistency that we'll win back our trust.
Before we close, my colleague Daniel Levy wasn't able to be here. You know Daniel quite well, and Gaith Alamari and our Middle East program. You, in those John Bolton hearings and other hearings in the Senate that I heard you speak, said this is a priority that cannot be held anymore, and the false choices that we tend to be making between one side of this equation and the other have to end. And I'm wondering if you have any closing thoughts on the Israel-Palestine question or the Middle East in general.
Yes, and I think I brought a compilation with me, and I wasn't expecting this question, but the number of times that President Bush talked about a viable, contiguous Palestinian state living side by side in peace with Israel. Over and over again. over and over again.
How many?
He did it in February before the American Enterprise Institute. He did it in July when he welcomed Abbas to the White House. He did it after signing the April 14th letter. He did it in February 22nd, the Brussels trip. Let me read this from Brussels. You mentioned that February of '05. So Israel must freeze settlement activity, help Palestinians build a thriving economy, and ensure that a new Palestinian state is truly viable with contiguous territory on the West Bank, not Bantustan, contiguous, viable on the West Bank. And then he goes on to say, a state of scattered territories will not work. And it goes back to the same credibility. Saying these words time and time again, on it goes, that's February of '05, then May of '06.
Do you mind if we put that on the web?
Not at all. October of '05, same words in essence, but not one effort behind the words. And I was there for it, chairman of the Middle East Subcommittee, at every hearing, saying, when are we going to see some effort? Real effort, not words. Never, never. And to me, of all the crimes or sins, that's one of the biggest ones, because the rest of the world thinks it's important, and they don't expect miracles. They don't expect us to wave a magic wand, but they want to see some effort. And all they want is some honesty. If we don't want a viable, contiguous Palestinian state living side by side in peace, say that. But don't keep saying us time and time again and doing the opposite. And it's a tragedy, great, great American tragedy.
Well, Senator Chafee, I want to thank you. You know, my blog, The Washington Note, which is loosely affiliated with New America, has only endorsed one race ever. I have you know, we'll flirt a lot with this presidential candidate or this Senate candidate, but I've only endorsed one candidate ever, and it was your Senate race. And so I've now begun to think maybe I should have spoken out against your election. It might have had the, you know, right negative impact. But
I'll take every endorsement.
I want to thank you for your leadership. I want to thank you for just being so real about this, and this question about, you know, working at the racetrack and somehow evolving as you did, obviously in a smart and well-connected family, but thinking about national security and strategy, priorities, disciplined thinking, you know, a kind of humble face to American foreign policy and rethinking what we need to do to sort of leapfrog into a different set of arrangements. There aren't a lot of folks that do that. And I do think that your story is a vital one for Americans to know. And again, I love Chapter 13. Thank you for all of that. So please help me join thanking.